Hello, everyone, and welcome to this very first event of the Pint of Science Festival 21. My name is Laura Luzia, and I will be hosting today's event with Elina van Blois. And we have a very special guest, Giulia Zoppolat, which is also a volunteer at Pint of Science Amsterdam, and she's a PhD student at the VU. She works in the psychology department, and today she will be talking about her research in love in times of COVID. The floor is yours, Giulia.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks for Pints of Science for having me here today. And thanks for everyone who's tuning in from wherever you are. As Laura mentioned, my name is Giulia Zoppolat. I'm a PhD candidate in psychology at the Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, and I am a relationship scientist. So my job is basically to try to figure out how romantic relationships work and what makes them challenging and the impact that they have on our life. And in the last year or so, I have been involved in a project called Love in the Time of COVID, in which we've been trying to understand the impact of the pandemic on people's most intimate relationships. And so what I'll be sharing with you is some of the latest data that we have from that project, and also from projects from collaborators from around the world to understand what love in the time of COVID has been looking like over the last year and some months. But before diving in, something that I wanted to share with you briefly is to quickly touch upon something that I often get asked as a relationship scientist, which is how do you even study romantic relationships? Is that even a science? And so I wanted to give you an idea of the type of projects that me and my colleagues work on, which is would involve some kind of inviting couples to there's this, I think should be seeing the slides, which would involve like inviting couples to come into the lab. They would come in, for example, at the Vrije Universiteit where I work. We would have them fill out a series of questionnaires. We would then ask them to engage, for example, in a videotaped conversation where they would, for example, talk about a conflict that they have in their relationship. And then we would track them over a period of time, over various days, months, and even years to see, for example, if there's some aspects that came up, some verbal and nonverbal behavior in the conversation that they had that could then predict later on down the line more functional or less functional, healthy or unhealthy relationship patterns, and even maybe breakup after a while. And I think, other than advancing science and advancing social sciences, this type of research is really important for one big reason, and that is that our relationships are really important for our mental and physical health. And it's as comparable to things like being physically active, eating a healthy diet, and not smoking. So the effects are comparable to these things that we know and have heard of for years and years are important for our health. And so relationships, strong, healthy relationships are as important as these other things. And so you might imagine that when the pandemic happened, I was really curious and a little bit worried about the effect that the pandemic would have on people's romantic relationships, given how important they are to our personal well-being. And so what I wanted to understand was what effect would all these changes in our lives, things like suddenly losing a job or suddenly being at home 24/7, maybe with a partner, maybe with children, what kind of effect would that have on people's personal lives, including their romantic relationships? So in March 2020, together with a group of international collaborators, I launched a study called Love in the Time of COVID, together with Dr. Richard Slatcher and Dr. Rhonda Balzarini and other international collaborators to answer these questions about love in the time of COVID. And I'm really excited to be sharing with you some of the data that we have from this project, because when we launched the study in March 2020, we didn't expect such an amazing response, but actually we got over 3,000 different responses from people around the world. And I think in the next slide, you should be seeing the map of the participants. And so we're kind of able to track how people from many different countries have been doing now over the last year in their relationship. So the data I'll be sharing with you today comes from this study, but also from a study from other collaborators and other data from like census data, for example. So the first thing I wanted to share with you was to answer this question. Was there a baby boom or a baby bust? So last year in March 2020, when the pandemic broke out, there was a lot of speculation. Would 9 months down the line, would we be seeing more or fewer babies being born? And there were kind of two competing ideas. On the one hand, there was this kind of romantic idea that couples that were stuck at home together, many with not that much to do, although not for a lot of couples. A lot of couples had suddenly child responsibilities. That they would end up basically engaging in more intimacy and more time together, maybe desire to start a family or add to the family. On the other hand, it's a pandemic. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's not exactly the easiest time to start a family or to add to the family. So what actually happened, now you can see the next slide, is that there was a baby bust. So across Europe, but also across the world in general, there seems to be a big decline in the number of births 9 months into the pandemic. So, for example, in Germany, for 50% of people who had planned on having a child decided to postpone it. In Italy and Spain, instead, we see that the birth rate declined by 20% compared to the previous year. And even other countries like Korea and Taiwan, they reported the lowest birth rate in the last 20 years. So definitely a baby bust. The romantic idea that couples who were at home together without much to do would engage in more intimacy just seemed not to pan out. So why may this be? Well, there is a very straightforward but important explanation to this, and that is that generally stress is bad for relationships, especially stress that is prolonged and that is severe. And this is exactly what we're seeing during the pandemic. And this is due to a phenomenon called the stress spillover effect, where outside stressors from the environment essentially spill over into people's private lives. And there's some really interesting work, for example, looking at people who experience a lot of work stress and how that can affect their romantic relationships. So in a classic study, they looked at air traffic controllers, so people who direct the traffic of airplanes. As you can imagine, that's kind of a stressful job. There's a lot on the line there, making sure that the planes land and take off as they're supposed to. People who experience more stress during this job, when they came home, they tended to exhibit kind of negative communication patterns with their romantic partner. And so what happens basically is that when people are experiencing the stress from the outside world, they engage in more negative and divisive behavior. They have less satisfying interactions. They evaluate their partner more negatively. They don't communicate as well, and therefore they have conflict. And this is exactly what we see in our own data, is that when people reported greater loneliness, more financial strain, and more worry due to the pandemic, they experienced more conflict in their relationship. And as you can imagine, this is kind of a desire suppressant. So people who experience more COVID-related stressors also experience more depression and had less sexual desire towards their partner. So in the next graph here, I wanted to show you exactly what this looks like. So this is from our data. On the x-axis here, you see to what degree has COVID-19 negatively impacted your financial situation? And then on the y-axis, you see how much conflict they had in their relationship. And basically, it's very clear as people experience more financial distress due to COVID, they just argue with their partner more. So this is a little bit, maybe not so surprising, but a bit bad news. Unfortunately, it seems like it's been hard for people and hard on their relationship. But there is a caveat. So we wanted to see if there was a factor that basically could shield people from these negative effects that these outside stressors were having on their relationship. And so we looked at something called perceived partner responsiveness. And this is something when people feel listened to, cared for, and loved by their partner. And what we found was that when people experience this love and care from their partner, they basically experience fewer of those negative effects from the outside world on their relationship. So they're basically protected from the stressors in a way, in terms of their romantic relationship. So in their next slide, there's the graph I wanted to show you. Thanks, Ty. So here it's a little bit complicated maybe, but I'll walk you through it. So on the x-axis here, again, we asked people to what degree has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted your financial situation? And then on the y-axis, again, you have conflict with the partner. So this bottom line, this like light turquoise color, are the people who felt really listened to by their partner. And what you can see here is that no matter their financial strain, people who felt really listened to by their partner didn't experience any more conflict, any more arguments with their partner. Instead, if you look up here, these are the people who felt not at all listened to by their partner. You can see here that they will generally experience more conflict, which we saw in the previous slide, but they especially experience more conflict when they experience more financial distress. So the combination of financial distress and having a partner who wasn't really receptive to them, really didn't listen to them, it's not a good combination, and we see this here. But on the other hand, the good news is that when people are receptive, are listening, are caring, they can basically help their relationship from these outside stressors that are occurring. So the main takeaway from this is basically that the quality of our relationships is what really matters, especially during times of stress. So it's not just having or not having a relationship. That can, depending on the quality of the relationship, that can have differing effects. So it's having a partner that is really caring, really responsive, that really is important during these times, such as during the pandemic. So now I've talked a little bit about couples during COVID. You might be wondering instead about how single people have been doing during this time. And it seems like generally single people have been having a hard time. People have been finding themselves maybe suddenly living alone, not seeing people for days, sometimes weeks at a time, not being able to connect with their normal social network. And we see this in our data as well, where people who were single experienced more loneliness than people who were in a relationship. And now I want to point out something important is that in other normal times, quote unquote, this isn't always the case. It's not that single people are generally more lonely. In fact, single people often have very strong social networks, and often even stronger social networks than people who have a romantic partner. But this is different. These are different times, and so single people didn't have that access to the social network that they might have had in times in which they, before the pandemic. So a big shift that occurred for people, single people, especially those wanting a relationship, is the change in the dating scene during the pandemic. So as you can imagine, or maybe you experienced yourself, dating during the pandemic seems to have been a very challenging thing. But very interestingly, if you look at data from the big dating apps, so things like Tinder, Bumble, Match, they had a boom in users from just the end of 2019 to 2020. And it seems that people have been flocking in greater numbers to these dating apps, perhaps pushed by these feelings of loneliness and desire to connect with people, because not only were they signing up for the dating apps more, but they were sending more messages and also having longer conversations than before. So people have been very active on dating apps, but how have they actually liked dating? So we asked people in our study how has it been to date during the pandemic. And generally speaking, people say that it's been much worse compared to before. As you can see, not many people said it was better. Most people thought it was not as good. And here are some quotes from our participants. Someone said, "I don't know why anyone would bother with online dating now when they can't even go and meet the person. At the moment, I do not have the energy or the motivation to meet someone new." So generally speaking,
sorry, may I just see a question popping up from
great. I can't read them, so please.
He or she is asking whether those conversations you were talking about, are they quality conversations, or are they just people messing around or not actually using it for romantic purposes?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that might be part of why it may not be as satisfying as one might hope. Is that because people were driven due to loneliness to the apps, they may not have actually engaged in more meaningful conversation. But on the other hand, it seems like people have been engaging in more meaningful conversation. When looking at some of the data on the content of people's bios, for example, or their opening lines, there's more mentions of things like boundaries and connection, especially before actually meeting someone. So people have, for example, been talking about what are your boundaries around meeting with or without masks, socially distanced, that kind of thing. And so talking about these really personal topics may have led to actually quite meaningful conversations about how people feel about risk taking and connecting. So I'm not sure if there were not as meaningful conversations as before. I think they're probably a mixed bag. But generally speaking, it seems like people have just not been enjoying it as much, at least the people in our data. And generally, it seems they feel like the pandemic has hurt their chances of having a romantic partner. But not everyone. So in the next slide, I wanted to share a couple quotes from people that are quite satisfied with their dating experience. So someone said, "I'm excited to have met someone new online who I'm quite into. I didn't think this would happen so quickly, and I'm excited about where it might go." And then someone else said, "My experience with online dating since the pandemic has been better because it made video chats more normative, which gives me the opportunity to meet up with someone more before being in person. It has relieved some of the pressure I typically put on myself when dating to know if I like someone faster than I usually am comfortable." And so this person is basically talking about the introduction of these video conversations that a lot of the apps have introduced, such as Bumble and Tinder and Hinge, where it has kind of changed the way people have been dating online, in that it has slowed down the process a great deal. So now, instead of chatting for a little bit and then making a meeting to meet up quite quickly in person, because the risks are so much higher, people are trying to basically suss out if this person is even worth the risk. And it's actually interesting to see, because we know that even in a video conversation, that is actually a good indication of whether or not you'll have some chemistry with someone. So it actually can save time and a lot of energy for people dating to have a video conversation before they actually go meet that person in real life. And so actually 40% of users on Bumble, for example, said that they would like to continue having these video conversations as part of their dating life after the pandemic ends. So I wanted to end this presentation with one last quote from a participant, another single participant in our study, who said, "I haven't had any interest in trying again with online dating apps. Instead, I'm using the time to reconnect with family and friends and spend quality time doing other things, such as working on online courses and learning new games to play online in groups." And I think this person is reacting in a very, we say, functional way, in that they are turning to their other relationships, other than potential romantic relationships, which is, I think, a really useful strategy for people who maybe feel a little bit like they don't want to be dating during the pandemic, it's too much effort. That it's really important to invest in your other relationships because of the benefits that they give us. So like I mentioned at the beginning, how our relationships are just as important as things like eating well and exercising. Well, that doesn't mean just your romantic relationships. You can get those benefits from all your relationships, such as your friendships. So the take-home message is essentially that whether you are single or in a relationship, taking care of your relationships is really important act of self-care and community care, especially during these difficult times. So with that, I want to really thank Pint of Science for having me, and thank you for tuning in. I can now look at your questions, which I wasn't able to do during my talk. But thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Giulia, for the very explanatory and simple talk. So I was wondering, so you said in the beginning, so there was this question about whether there was a baby boom or a baby bust. And then you show this plot where basically we can see that couples that communicate better, they were, let's say, they would cope better with the stress related with the pandemics. So because we see this baby bust, does this mean that, or does this indicate that couples are not communicating that well? I don't know, or maybe this is too much speculation, but I was, just wondering whether or not you could get some kind of extra information from your data.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say that it's probably that, not necessarily a symptom of couples not communicating well, because maybe they are communicating well about their change of plans. Maybe that, like, for example, the 50% of people in Germany who had planned to have a child in 2020 and then decided against it. That could be coming from a very healthy dynamic in the relationship where they decided together that they wanted to change course, essentially. So I think it's more to do with just the very practical aspects and the real challenges that people have been experiencing. For example, we've been seeing, people with small children at home. It's been especially difficult for them with juggling, maybe working from home and their child education online. I think people have been thinking twice about whether or not they wanted to do that because of the great burden, especially on women, to take care of their children during this time. So I don't think I would speculate more from that data.
So that would be more in the socio-economic factors, let's say.
Yeah, and we see that, for example, people who are in more socially disadvantaged economic groups experience more distress and just more negative emotions. They have more difficulties with their mental health. So it's just an environment that is not necessarily conducive to family, increasing the family essentially.
Okay.
Yeah, and there was also a question from the audience. Was there a difference in relationship satisfaction between couples living together and those that lived apart during the pandemic?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but what we did see is that people tended to make decisions much more quickly for their relationship than they would have otherwise. So we see that people are speeding up their relationship, for example. So couples that were living apart, faced with the possibility of not seeing each other for a long time, maybe suddenly decided to move together more quickly than they would have otherwise. We're also seeing the opposite, where people who maybe had some trouble in their relationship decided, let's just call it quits. And so I don't know if there's a difference in satisfaction in terms of couples living together and couples living apart, but we're seeing, for example, this speeding up in relationship decisions. And we also found, for example, we also measured how much personal space people felt that they had. So couples who had small spaces to share were struggling more, as you would imagine, than couples who had more space, maybe their own private office, space for the children. When couples that had maybe smaller spaces, especially with children, were having more difficulties. So I think that's a situation in which socioeconomic status would have a big impact.
Okay.
We have one more question. It says, do you think that when we go back to normal, people will still have difficulty meeting in person fast?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting speculation as to whether the anxieties that now we may be experiencing in meeting up, how long it will take for us to get adjusted. We know that human beings, we're really resilient. We tend to adjust to whatever situation we have in front of us quite quickly. For example, I noticed that I adjusted to working from home quite quickly, even though it was sometimes challenging. And so people tend to be very resilient and change with the times. And so I think there's going to be some difficulties, some anxieties, particularly for people who are maybe more risk averse than others. But I think generally people tend to adapt quickly. So I think it'll be, maybe more quickly than we might imagine, we'll be able to go back to socializing as we once did, hopefully.
And do you think that what we've gotten used to now, so the more online dating and the including the video chatting, for instance, do you think that will still be have a major impact on us later on still? So even though we go back to a normal situation, so to speak, that we will still be affected by it?
Yeah, I think in the way that dating is changing, I think there's some changes that are here to stay. If you look at dating from a historical lens, dating has changed over the last 100 years a whole great deal. And so I think this is just another step in the evolution of dating. And the people who like the video chats during the pandemic are probably going to like it after it's over. We see people who say things like, oh, wow, I don't have to spend my money on time on someone who wouldn't have been worth it for me. So I think that that is probably gonna continue, and that what we're seeing is like apps like Hinge and Bumble. They're really investing in this new platform, so they seem to think that it's here to stay.
Okay.
And do you think that we will have a baby boom after the pandemic is well, not over, but at least controlled?
Yeah, who knows? I mean, based on, we might have another roaring 20s as they did in the 1920s. It could be depending on financially how things go. I think some of these stressors are here to stay for a long time, particularly for people who experienced, maybe lost their job or experienced a lot of health issues. That's going to be, it's not going to go away from one day to the next. So it is to be determined. If you look at the literature from other crises in history, everything from natural disasters to terrorist attacks, there is mixed effects, basically mixed bag. Sometimes there's a baby boom, sometimes there's a baby bust. But for now, baby bust, it seems.
Yeah, exactly. I can imagine that. If COVID really affected you economically, I mean, even after all this crisis, you might not be in that healthy, let's say, economically healthy situation to, want to have children and to raise them. And many people are really, experience difficult situations, but maybe, other people will indeed maybe want to have kids, and then you have this mixed effect.
And I think we're seeing that the people that were doing well tend to keep doing well, and the people that weren't doing well tend to keep suffering. So we'll see a big divide based on these socioeconomic factors, unfortunately.
Yeah, and we have another audience question. So have you gotten a chance to look at your data to see how parents and families feel during the pandemic?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, we're working on a project on about family and parental duties. And as you can imagine, or as you probably heard from other news sources, that women have been mostly disadvantaged from the pandemic. So the big proportion, for example, of people who've lost their jobs have been women. And so you can imagine that is negatively affecting the family dynamic. People with small children at home particularly have been struggling with the education at home. It's been especially hard for families who have had financial difficulties and who have small children or children that need particular care.
Okay. Yeah, and so what about a relationship that are not necessarily romantic? So if you're talking about, family, so you just also talked about parents, or maybe friends. Like, is there research on that?
Yeah, it's coming. So you can feel free to look at our website, loveinthetimeofcovid.me, and where we give some updates on our project. So for example, we've been measuring how much people have been interacting with family and friends in person and online. And we do see that when people, for example, interact even with their family and friends online, that helps them, of course, feel less lonely than when they don't do so. But there's more to come on this topic. I don't have the latest yet.
Okay.
Okay, we have one more question from Albert. Have you found that people are more willing to engage now, not only in romantic as such, but also in newfound online activities at a distance? For instance, movie watching or readings, games, future travel plans.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we're seeing people engaging in what we call self-expanding activities. So things that like you mentioned, movie watching, reading, going on walks in your neighborhood, doing all these other things. And it's really important for well-being. And so people have been doing, for example, people have been using VR during this time, engaging in other things to kind of offset the things that we can't do. And so, for example, couples that do this together, but I would imagine it's also similar with friends. That helps strengthen relationships and helps people's mental health.
Okay, wow, yeah, that's really, really cool, to be honest. Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I also believe that we have answered all of our audience's questions. So I'm afraid we're gonna have to wrap up for today. So I want to thank you a lot, Giulia, for being here, and Laura, also thank you for hosting the event. You can check out the links to this event and more backgrounds. So this event was the kickoff of the Pint of Science Festival in the Netherlands. Tomorrow, Mirjam Bloemendaal, Mandy Meijer, and Babette Jacobi will be talking about everything you didn't know about ADHD. So make sure to check that out as well. And have an amazing evening, everyone.
Yeah, you too. And thank you, Giulia, for being here today. It was really nice to see how we could go from something, challenges that COVID imposed to opportunities, right? Because that was really about your research, seeing the opportunities in the pandemic and make something out of it. So thank you for your talk.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for dropping by. And feel free to look us up at loveinthetimeofcovid.me for updates on how people have been doing.
Yes, I think we shared the website in our platforms in the description, so people can have a look.
Great.
All right. Thank you.
Bye. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Bye.